Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 272. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have updates on the war in Ukraine, and I want to talk about some U.S. politicians, particularly Senator Lindsey Graham, who is now pushing for the U.S. to escalate to the point of a nuclear exchange in Ukraine. So we are entering a very new dangerous phase of this war. Please share today's show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Video version on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. You can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnslone_ or the show on Twitter at con_interest. And you can donate to the show on Patreon, Subscribestar, and we have the crypto information in the show notes page. You can also support the show by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE that will save you 20% when you spend $75 or more. This past weekend, I was actually in San Antonio at the Oblar's home. They're the owners of Paloma Verde. It's a great small business run by libertarians. Fantastic family. It's such great people. And at the Paloma Verde event, we spoke a little bit and did some other stuff, but, really getting to know the Oblars and the product a little bit more was absolutely fantastic. And so, as always, I highly recommend all their products, but their sports cream is my absolute favorite. And I was talking to quite a few other people at the event, and the sports cream comes very highly recommended because of how well the pain relief works and how good it is compared to its competition. And so, if you're going to the local pharmacy to pick up whatever the traditional options are, for some people it doesn't work. For other people it works, but the smell is too intense, or the hot to cold sensations are way too intense. And so if you don't want any of that mess, you just get some nice smelling menthol scented CBD cream. Helps you to wake up a little bit in the morning. Go check out the Paloma Verde sports cream, but all their products are absolutely fantastic. And of course, the lab tester results are right there on the website, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. And now let's get into the show. First article today is one that I wrote yesterday for antiwar.com. Senator Graham pushes to designate Moscow a state sponsor of terror and escalate support for Kiev. He says the war only ends with President Vladimir Putin's removal from power and the Russian leader is no longer has an off-ramp. And so Graham says a lot in this interview. Some of it I cover in this article, some of it I don't, but I really want to get into all of it on today's show. But this terrorist designation is particularly interesting and probably the part of what Graham says in his Fox News Sunday interview with Bret Baier that has the most potential of actually being adopted into policy. So, Senator Lindsey Graham said the U.S. must pursue an even more aggressive strategy against Russia. While appearing on Fox News Sunday with Bret Baier, the hawkish senator advocated for a barrage of actions targeting Moscow. Graham promoted a new piece of legislation he co-authored with Senator Richard Blumenthal that calls on the White House to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Senator Graham published an op-ed on Friday arguing the designation will allow the U.S. to conduct more legal and economic warfare against Russia. However, in the op-ed, Graham does not argue or link Russia to a terrorist group. Rather, he compares the invasion of Ukraine to the Nazi military campaign during World War II and claimed Vladimir Putin is a megalomaniac wanting to rewrite the map of Europe and recreate the former Russian Empire. And so this, part is really interesting. Again, I think this is the piece that probably has the most new uniqueness to Lindsey Graham as he wrote the op-ed for this bill, as he's the co-author with Senator Richard Blumenthal. But this being a bipartisan piece of legislation, the fact that the U.S. rhetoric about Russia at this point, it's just universally accepted that, and no doubt that there are war crimes going on in Ukraine, but this is being portrayed as one of the most brutal wars ever waged. And that is, it's being compared in this op-ed and by other people constantly to the Nazi campaign during World War II. And, if we look at what's happening in Ukraine, it's just not the case, right? Wars could be bad, wars could be aggressive, war crimes could be committed, and it could not be as bad as Hitler's invasion of World War II or several other campaigns, like, say, the U.S.-backed Islamic State campaign through Syria and Iraq, or particularly the initial U.S. invasion of Iraq. And, there's other different things that you could look at over the past 20 years and compare it to. But, to really make the argument just based off of how terrible Russia is, that they deserve to be on the state sponsor terrorism list, you could look at crimes all over the world committed by governments that are just far worse. I mean, during this conflict, it seems far more people in Ethiopia have been killed during in the battles between the government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Videos surfacing online that even the Ethiopian government didn't dismiss as, being just propaganda of people being burned alive in that country. If you look at what's happening, not currently because the situation in Yemen is a little bit better, but over the past 7 years, the way the Saudis have terrorized the people of Yemen, I mean, that is a far more atrocious war than what Putin is doing in Ukraine, at least, to this point. We look at it 7 years later and maybe change our mind on that a little bit. But the deliberate starvation campaign that the United States and Saudi Arabia have waged in Yemen, the bombing deliberately of civilian infrastructure centers, school buses full of children, deliberately picked as targets. Not just that, like the U.S. would present as a horrible mistake, something went wrong, or, bombing up funerals and wedding parties, things like that. But so anyways, I do think this is a concern that this bill could move forward. And a little bit of good news, too, by the way, on probably last week's show, maybe it was last Tuesday or Wednesday's show, I had discussed the potential of a new authorization for use of military force, with Adam Kinzinger being the sponsor for that. Now, fortunately, apparently he has not gotten any other co-sponsors on that bill, and people are very wary of it. I was actually looking back right before the invasion of Ukraine, there was actually a group of 40 representatives that sent a letter to Biden saying that, you don't have the authority to wage a war in Ukraine at this point. So it is good to see that at least Congress isn't lining up to throw away their congressional war powers on this issue. However, as with my initial reaction to that bill, I didn't think it was going to immediately pick up steam and get passed. My concern is that it's going to linger, and in its state of lingering, it's eventually going to become somebody's cause and be like, oh, hey, if we were really serious about Ukraine, we would pass this, and then it'll start to pick up and build momentum from there. In Senator Graham's appearance on, it's just his first half, by the way. If you want to watch it, it's a 10-minute long video, but the second half is all, or at least, most of it's about the Supreme Court. So if you just watch the first 4.5 minutes, that's the foreign policy stuff. The senator also urges the passing of the $33 billion aid bill for Ukraine. I think it's a foregone conclusion that will pass, and the only question is if it'll get bigger. It was worth noting that Graham didn't call for it to get bigger. He called for prosecuting Vladimir Putin for war crimes through the International Criminal Court, which is interesting because the U.S. isn't actually a party to the ICC, and Lindsey Graham and other Republicans particularly are fairly opposed to the ICC and some of its actions because it's looked into Israel, it's looked into potential U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, and in fact, the Trump administration sanctioned the ICC, and so it seems like there's a bit of American hypocrisy here by trying to use the ICC against Russia now. And he also called for putting more weapons in theater that could target Ukraine, Graham called for putting more weapons in theater that can target the Russian military offensively. Which is interesting because on Saturday, the day before, the Speaker of the Russian State Duma called the Western intervention in Ukraine amounting to direct attacks against Russia, saying Washington essentially coordinates and develops military operations, thereby participating in direct hostilities against our country. Now, Graham also cites Chechnya, Syria, and Ukraine, and then says the U.S. needs to triple down. And this triple down comment I thought was extremely interesting because it's in response to something that William Burns said, who's, of course, the CIA director. And I'm sure, as members of my audience know, this is the guy who penned the memo to Condoleezza Rice. Niet means niet, explaining that the issue of Ukraine NATO membership is the brightest of all red lines for Russians, and not just Vladimir Putin, but even his political opposition, sees this as a legitimate security concern for Russia, Ukrainian NATO membership. Now, you don't have to agree, but understand that the Russian political leadership does. And so, right, this is something that we need to factor into when moving forward. And what William Burns was explaining was that because, not necessarily, he didn't say because of that, but he was saying that, Putin sees this as a legitimate top priority security issue, and because of all the support for Ukraine, he's saying that Putin is going to double down. And so Lindsey Graham hears that, and being the fool that he is, responds not by saying, okay, well, we're going to try to counter that. He says we're going to triple down. Like, it's almost a natural physical number, right? That William Burns was saying, oh, Russia's going to double the amount of support. And Graham's like, well, then we'll triple it. Where what, I think what Burns is saying is something that goes back to the Obama administration. One of the reasons that Obama didn't escalate the war in Ukraine, and that's because Russia maintains escalation dominance in Ukraine. The idea here is that because it's so close to Russia, just with the amount of weapons Russia is going to pour in and willing to pour in, to be quite honest, and the amount of Russian lives that they're willing to spend in Ukraine versus the number of Western lives that they're willing to spend in Ukraine, the number is just entirely different. And this means that, Russia has escalation dominance, and also they have nuclear weapons, which is the ultimate kind of escalation dominance, right? And because of this, Burns is arguing and trying to tell people that if you continue to escalate, then Russia is going to continue to escalate. I don't think Senator Graham really understands this, and I think he is just, kind of foolishly trying to have a nice statement saying that he needed to triple down. Now, it's really interesting in this interview because Bret Baier posed two questions to Lindsey Graham, asking if he was concerned that increasing military involvement in Ukraine could lead to a direct confrontation with Russia. And in one of those questions, he actually cited Thomas Friedman, who, I view as an uber war hawk and definitely a part of the foreign policy blob. However, Friedman has a recent article out basically saying that the amount of support that we're now considering giving Ukraine is too much. It's going to escalate the tensions with Russia to the point where there's going, I don't know if he says some kind of direct confrontation, but it's just escalating the tensions with Russia too much. And Graham was dismissive of this, of a potential conflict, basically saying the U.S. has no choice, saying we can't let Putin win in Ukraine. And he made several statements similar to this. Graham then boldly called on the U.S. to take out Putin and said the Russian leader no longer had an off-ramp. He predicted that a lack of an off-ramp would provoke Putin to use chemical or nuclear weapons, causing the U.S. to enter the conflict directly. In response to chemical weapons, he said the U.S. would establish a no-fly zone. He said nuclear weapons would provoke NATO to invoke Article 5 in a direct war to break out between Russia and the West. And so, I mean, this is just a crazy thing that he is saying. He's saying that the policy that the U.S. should pursue will provoke Putin to use chemical or nuclear weapons of mass destruction, to cause the U.S. to enter the conflict. This is lunacy. Rather than doing everything we can to prevent these weapons from being used, he's saying that the U.S. should do everything they can to get these weapons to be used by Russia to give the U.S. basically an excuse to enter this conflict. Now, Look, Lindsey Graham is a member of the opposition party. He's a Republican hack, and everything he does is just trying to give himself more political capital in order to leverage that political capital to wage more war. That's what the guy has done for years and years and years and years. And so, in a sense, shouldn't be maybe too worried about him. However, this is the policy that the Biden administration is pursuing at this point, with the amount of escalation that that they've had in this war, with the leads coming out saying that the U.S. is providing intelligence to Ukraine to take out Russian generals and Russian ships. Very interesting. We had a report from ABC News last week, and Dave DeCamp wrote this up at antiwar.com. Biden tells officials leads on Ukraine intel must stop. According to a report from NBC News, President Biden spoke with top administration officials on Friday and said the reports in the media about U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine have been counterproductive. The report cited two anonymous administration forces who said Biden spoke with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, CIA Director William Burns, and Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines. One source said Biden told the reporters told them the reports distract from our objective, while the other source said he conveyed the leads must stop. This week, U.S. officials claimed to media outlets that U.S. intelligence was used to help kill Russian generals and aided Ukraine in the sinking of a Russian warship, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. While the claims aren't confirmed and it might not be true, the fact that U.S. officials are making such statements to the media is a major provocation towards Moscow. One of the very important things that changed my foreign policy analysis, I think for the better over the years, was understanding that when you're looking at foreign countries, what they believe is almost as important as what the actual truth is. And so even if the U.S. isn't actually providing this intelligence, the fact that U.S. officials are leaking it to the media, and of course, unlike when, say, Julian Assange publishes some documents and the U.S. does everything they can to find the leaker, and it doesn't seem like anything is being done. It's still early, so who knows? Maybe the FBI has started up an investigation. They're carrying it out. But much more likely, whatever official was sharing this was doing so with at least wink and a nod level of approval from whatever their department they're from, likely the DOD or the CIA or something like that. And it was more of an official leak than, some kind of agile leak that exposes something that shouldn't be happening. It's, making the Biden administration look tough and things like that is, my guess, partly how the leaker sees it. John Kirby said the U.S. was providing relevant and timely intelligence, and that if they decide to do something with that intelligence, then they made the decisions about acting on it, which is a pretty coy way of saying that, yeah, we provide the intelligence for sinking the ship. The Biden administration has expanded intelligence sharing with Ukraine since Russia invaded, but U.S. officials have previously been hesitant to disclose the details over fears of provoking Moscow. On top of the increased intelligence sharing, the Biden administration continues to escalate military aid to Ukraine. Biden is seeking from Congress $33 million in new assistance for Kiev, which includes $20.4 billion in military aid. The U.S. objective in the war goes beyond helping Ukraine defend itself, and the administration is digging in for a long-term campaign. Austin recently said the U.S. That one of the goals is to see a weakened Russia. So this is, a big part of it, too, that it's not about Ukraine. Now, I think that's about all I have here on the Lindsey Graham interview on Fox News. I recommend watching it. It's wild, the things that he says and how confidently he says that we need to take Putin out. I mean, this is a regime change in a nuclear the largest nuclear arsenal state. I mean, this is extremely dangerous and potentially destabilizing. And again, the idea that there's no off ramp from Putin at this point. There's no way that the U.S. is going to allow a negotiated settlement in Ukraine that allows Putin to claim victory and stay in power. Basically means that this war isn't going to end. If you just look at the geopolitical balance between Ukraine and Russia, if this war is to end anytime soon, it likely means that Ukraine will have to cede a portion of its territory, and then allow Putin to claim victory in Moscow and agree to some form of neutrality. And if we're not willing to do that and recognize that agreement and lift sanctions, then that this is a very, very long war coming up. Now, it's not just Lindsey Graham. Have this article here from the Wall Street Journal titled, "The U.S. should show it can win a nuclear war. Washington must study the Cold War era practices that had a major effect on Soviet policy making." And this is by Seth Crosby, and he's with Youngstown Institute. And basically his argument is the U.S. needs to attack Russian nuclear-powered their nuclear submarines. Just start attacking them, picking them off now. And apparently, this is going to show Russia that we really mean business and we are not to be trifled with. And I guess taking out their second strike capabilities, right? That's the goal here. Now, I guess, Mr. Crosby thinks that Russia is going to say, well, you took out 2 of our nuclear powered submarines. And so, dang, well, this is, we're just going to leave this. This is the kind of thing that I think would provoke Russia to major escalations in this war, if not outright using nuclear weapons, potentially on direct American targets, if the U.S. is starting to take out the Russian military submarines. I mean, this is insanely dangerous. He also calls for the U.S. to put nuclear I believe cruise missiles, but nuclear missiles onto the naval fleet and then put that fleet into the Black Sea. So, we have a growing number of these kind of people, though, and I see more and more of these stories coming out of the U.S. foreign policy establishment that somehow we could go to war with Russia. And you have different classes. You have the people who just assert that Russia can't go to nuclear war with us. It's not going to happen. We could escalate to any degree we want, and Russia won't use nukes. Now, they make a somewhat technical argument saying that Russia doesn't have the Russian nuclear weapons haven't been maintained to a standard needed to actually be confident that they could carry out a nuclear attack. Now, Russia has 6,000 nukes, and I mean, there may be some minor amount of truth to the statement that there may be some level of decay to Russian nukes, that they're not sure that every single one of the warheads that they fire off will go off, but they have a lot of missiles that have multiple, warheads on reentry. And, it really only takes 1 out of every 10 of the 6,000 Russian nukes to actually be able to function properly, to do everything they need to do to destroy all life in North America. So, I don't see any particular reason to think that there could be a potential conventional war with Russia. Now, I'm not saying that just because a U.S. ship fires on a Russian ship in the Black Sea, that the situation there can't be de-escalated. But there's no desire in America to de-escalate that situation. And honestly, that most people are directly opposed to it and saying that, no, we want the opposite. We want the Biden administration to continue to escalate and respond to Russia in that situation. And so it's just absurd to think that there would be a conflict between the U.S. and Russia that remained conventional. One-off events maybe could happen if both parties are interested in de-escalation, but that's really not the status quo right now. And then you have a second group, which, there's something nuclear war, right? And so they're advocating for policies, and they just really don't acknowledge that, 2 or 3 steps down the line, there's a big mushroom cloud staring you right in the face. And that should be something that they have to address, but they just simply don't. And I'm not sure what the reason is. And then we now have more and more people just openly suggesting that the U.S. engage in this conflict, and that either we could bat down Russia's nuclear capabilities, and Mr. Crosby is explaining, or as Lindsey Graham said, well, Russia will use a nuclear or chemical weapon in Ukraine, and then NATO will respond by getting involved. And I guess that's how we're going to wipe out all life on this planet. All right, we'll move on and talk about some other stories on Ukraine. This one has many hints of nuclear conflict as well, by myself and Will Porter on Cinco de Mayo from the Libertarian Institute. NATO will have a very strong obligation to Sweden if it applies for NATO membership. NATO civilian leader came close to offering Sweden a security guarantee if Stockholm decides to apply for membership in the bloc, even before it's formally accepted, with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg vowing new military deployments to the Baltics during the application period. Sweden and its neighbor Finland have both considered nuclear NATO membership since Russia invaded Ukraine. However, the two countries have expressed concern that their application could provoke a strong response from Moscow, as it could take more than a year before all NATO member states greenlight their request. Leaders in both capitals fear the Kremlin could launch an attack during that time before they receive the mutual defense pact promised to all members. To alleviate the concern, Swedish Foreign Minister Ann Linde said Wednesday that Stockholm had received assurances from the U.S. that it would get security support during their NATO application period. Naturally, I'm not going to go into the details, but I feel very sure now that we have American assurances. She said following a sit-down with her American counterpart Antony Blinken, though noted no concrete security guarantees were given, as those were reserved for full NATO members only. And so this is really dumb, and I hate this kind of stuff, but it's worth pointing out and talking about real quick. There's a big difference between a security assurance, which just is like, if your guy comes over and he's like, oh man, this guy really wants my ass, and you like pat him on the back and like, oh, I got your, back anytime or something like that, just saying it and you don't really mean it, versus, somebody you say it to and they're like, yeah, ride or die, homie, family for life, let me come stay at your place and we'll make sure that you're going to be all right, which is, more a guarantee. So there's a pretty big difference between the two. One's empty rhetoric, and a guarantee is at least a very strong promise for actual defense. Now, if the U.S. will always come through in those cases could depend, but at least we are making a very strong promise that I do think people intend on following through on. Stoltenberg took the promise a step further on Thursday, however, saying that from the potential moment that Sweden applying for membership and NATO says that they want Sweden to join, there's a very strong obligation from NATO to be able to guarantee Sweden's security. See, there he adds guarantee. He added that forces should be quickly deployed to the Baltic region, which encompasses NATO members Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, as well as Finland and Sweden. Moscow has warned that it would react sharply if the two NATO Nordic states are admitted into the alliance, even suggesting nuclear deployments to the region in retaliation. And this is from Deputy Chairman of Russia's Security Council and its President, Dmitry Medvedev. There can be no more talk of any nuclear-free status in the Baltics. The balance must be restored. And I think Russia has floated the idea of deploying hypersonic nuclear capable missiles to the region. And I should add too, I believe the UK also to Sweden and Finland offered a security assurance if they apply for NATO membership. All right, the next article I wrote yesterday for antiwar.com. The West announces new weapons for Kiev, sanctions on Moscow. The U.S. and its allies will provide Ukraine with billions in weapons and phase out oil imports from Russia. A meeting of Western leaders resulted in a pledge to transfer over $1 billion in arms to Ukraine and a new round of sanctions targeting the Russian economy. On Sunday, during a call with leaders from the Group of Seven, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised to send $1.6 billion in security assistance to Ukraine, including radars, GPS jamming equipment, and night vision. The massive new package from Downing Street is in addition to the $150 million the White House authorized to send to Kiev on Friday. The latest American weapons transfer includes 25,000 artillery rounds and counter-radar jamming equipment. Almost every NATO member state and several other allied countries have assisted Ukraine's war effort. London is estimated to have contributed about $3 billion in weapons, while the U.S. has added over $3.5 billion. Warsaw claims to have transferred $1.5 billion in arms to its neighbor. In addition to weapons, the G7 countries, including U.S., Britain, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan, announced they would step up their effort to crush the Russian economy by phasing out oil imports from Moscow. We will hit hard at the main artery of Putin's economy and deny him revenue he needs to fund this war, a joint statement by the G7 said. It adds, we will ensure that will do in a timely and orderly fashion and in ways that provide the time the world needs to secure alternative supplies. President Joe Biden also announced new unilateral sanctions on Sunday. The U.S. has blacklisted 3 Russian media outlets, Channel 1 Russia, Russia 1, and NTV, and 27 executives from the Gazprom Bank, which is the bank that works with the Russian energy company Gazprom. The White House placed a travel ban on thousands of officials from Russia and Belarus. Additionally, it barred American accounting and consulting firms from doing business in Russia, saying that, this was going to cut down on rich Russians getting out their money or saving their money from being, I guess, seized by West or Western sanctions or tax burdens, things like that. Not sure if this is actually going to have that big of an impact, or if some lady that has a freelance accounting business or something who works with a small business in Russia is now going to be subject to U.S. sanctions as well. Dave DeCamp, at the end of last week, wrote up the article on the new $150 million military aid package, and he points out that the new running total for U.S. aid to Ukraine is $3.55 billion since the start of the invasion alone. This also from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Pentagon draws $1.4 billion to replenish weapons stocks sent to Ukraine. Dave says the Pentagon has transferred $1.4 billion out of a new Ukraine replacement transfer fund to replenish the stockpiles of weapons the U.S. has been sending to Ukraine, the Washington Examiner reported on Friday. The $1.4 billion came from the $13.6 billion bill of Ukraine that was included in the spending bill passed in March. Out of the $1.4 billion, $1.1 will go to the Army, and $370 million will go for Stinger missiles to the Navy. Since Russia has invaded, the U.S. has sent Kiev at least 5,500 javelins and 1,400 Stingers, and this has prompted Joe Biden to go visit a Lockheed Martin facility that was making Javelin missiles, and now Lockheed Martin says they're going to be able to double their production of Javelin missiles to about 4,000 missiles every year at this point going forward. And so, I'm guessing that those are going to be quite significant investments that they have to make to, double their production. And so, these weapons companies that have been meeting with President Joe Biden are ramping up their production for years to come now, right? This isn't just, we think it's going to be a 6-month war. They're looking to spend on this thing for and cash in on this thing for years to come. All right, before I wrap up here, got, I think, 2 more articles left. Here is one. Biden speaks with German leader Olaf Scholz amid Kiev-Berlin tensions. The United States, this is from myself and Will Porter on May 6th from the Libertarian Institute. The United States and Germany will reject all Russian territorial claims in Ukraine, leaders from both countries said during a recent phone call, as relations between Berlin and Kiev plugged to new deaths over alleged close ties between German president and his Russian counterpart. A statement issued by the German government followed Thursday's call noted that Biden and Scholz stressed that they will not recognize any steps that are contrary to the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine, agreeing that they have no legitimacy. They condemned in the strongest possible terms recent statements by the Russian leadership to discredit democratically legitimate Ukrainian government, the statement continued. So this is, interesting. We had an attempt by the German president, Olaf Scholz is the chancellor, the president has less power, to go to Ukraine. Ukraine rejected him going, so now I believe Scholz and the president will be heading to Ukraine, probably Kiev sometime shortly. The comments on Ukraine's sovereignty mirror a position recently staked out by British officials, with Foreign Secretary Liz Truss saying sanctions on Moscow will not be removed until all of its forces are withdrawn from all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which has been under Russian control since 2014. The hardline Western policy against Russia recognizing any territorial concessions could obstruct a negotiated settlement between Moscow and Kiev, as the Kremlin insists that Ukraine accept its claims over Crimea, as well as the independence of the 2 Russian-speaking breakaway states in the Donbass region. The Turkish foreign minister, who has helped mediate negotiations between the warring parties, recently warned that some NATO members prefer to see fighting continue in order to weaken Russia, regardless of what that means for Ukraine. A report in the Washington Post last month similarly noted that for some in the alliance, it's better for the Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying than to achieve a peace that comes too early or at too high a cost, citing a number of diplomats and officials. Scholz himself, in an interview earlier this week, said that Berlin would not ease its own sanctions on Moscow without an agreement from Ukraine, suggesting the penalties could continue indefinitely despite repeatedly claiming Germany's sole claim is to save lives and end the war. So this is, really interesting and really important how the policy of Europe, the West, and NATO is developing in Ukraine, where it should be, by their rhetoric, that they've sold their civilians, their people, on why they need to get involved. It's about saving Ukrainian lives. And so all the pressure should be just on Moscow withdrawing its forces, and particularly withdrawing its forces from places of Ukraine that don't want the Russian forces there, which is, maybe beyond the line of control that previously of the Donbass. Now, the Kiev could come out and work with something on Moscow that establishes the fact that Russia has invaded and conquered more territory. But the pressure should be to get to get Moscow to agree to what, Kiev is willing to accept, so we could have Ukrainians stop dying. But that's not the goal. The goal is to weaken Russia. That's why Lindsey Graham his position is concerning, because if the position is to weaken Russia, it's going to lead down the Lindsey Graham path, and it's going to cross all those things that Lindsey Graham was talking about, and it's going to give the guy a lot of power in the United States to dictate the position here. All right. Oh, and last mention here before I wrap up. The U.S. is looking to accelerate the pace that it reestablishes its embassy in Kiev. So that's that, I think. Thank you everybody so much for tuning in. I will have more content later in the week. I planned to have a little bit more on the show today, but I was traveling this weekend, had the event in San Antonio with Paloma Verde, palomaverdecbd.com, promo code PEACE. And then I also had a talk last week that I gave, so 2 live events last week on the Ukraine-Russia conflict with Denver Liberty on the Rocks. And I'm really excited for when they post that one, because I do think I could run that as an episode of the show, and I think y'all will really enjoy it. So anyways, a lot of great stuff coming out this week. I'm really excited about the interviews I have. As always, every Monday, I'm on the Misty Winston Show on TNT Radio. So check me out there, and I'll have more content later in the week.